So there we go. We'll go for the little intro so that people who are watching on, well, I think occasionally I get a comment on Facebook. So people do sometimes watch the stream, I think, on Facebook. So there we go. So hello, it's me, and we'll do the welcome. Do the welcome. So good to be back, and the good thing is, after last week where I got totally thrown because I had a totally full hard drive on my computer, I managed to remove about a couple of 100 gigabytes of space from it, so we should be fine today to kind of work through. So we're looking at, as you can see at the bottom, we're looking at Matthew. We've gone into Matthew 13 now, verses 1 to 23. Well, actually, let's bring it up. There we go. I called it Pareto parables. I've often used the Pareto because this little run includes the verse that's sometimes referred to now as the Matthew principle, which was then related to the Pareto distribution. But it's basically, if you want to be cynical, you sum it up with the sense of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But it's the to whom has more gets given, which is often a challenging verse to us, but actually is one of those things that the reason it's kind of identified in modern economics, in mathematics and other things, is actually it touches on something very real, and we'll explore that a little bit more. But I've given it the plural here in the title. I think in the email that went out, it just had the singular. I thought afterwards I should have put the plural. So because actually the Matthew 13 introduces a section of a run of multiple parables. And it's kicked off with the first parable, which we're going to see is actually a parable about how you're supposed to engage with parables, which is why it's there. So, so the first parable is kind of explained in detail because it explains a little bit about how parables work. And there is something very significant about the run of parables and the fact Jesus teaches in parables. Is you pick up in Psalm 78 verse 2, which is God speaking. I will open my mouth in a parable. I'll utter dark sayings of old. Or as I put it in the translation, if anyone bought the little Jesus in the Psalms book, I will gush out hidden sayings or ancient archaic sayings. And the wonderful thing, so I kind of summarize that verse is because God kind of says the way I speak is parables and puzzles, and just as a kind of an upfront before we get into the text of Matthew, that there's something we're going to see as we kind of go straight into this, is that when God speaks, he speaks in a way that requires our engagement to actually understand. We don't look at the surface. Well, you can look at the surface, as Jesus points out, but it looking at the surface doesn't really have much depth, and sometimes it can be detrimental. And we have to kind of look through the surface and engage with it. And I think that the thing that I find kind of exciting about that idea is that right from the kind of the get-go, there's an acknowledgement by God that when he speaks, it requires more from us than just a kind of cursory, oh yeah, I got that. It kind of draws us into something, and so we'll unpack that a little bit as we go through. So if you remember the flow, most of Matthew 12, we looked at, if you synchronize the beginning of Matthew 12, or it may have even been the end of Matthew 11, you see the process. There's been a process that starts, in fact, as you kind of integrate it with John's gospel, Luke's gospel, John and Luke particular, you find that there's a kind of a run of things that have happened down in Jerusalem with controversies around the Sabbath before and then through Passover. And we come through Passover, and there's the passing through the grain fields on the first Sabbath, which is therefore just one Sabbath after the wave offering, very close to Passover. And Jesus is still down there. And it seems that then the events of chapter 12 kind of, Jesus is progressing back up the pilgrim way that runs down the Jordan Valley, cuts across then through Jericho down to Jerusalem. He's working back up that way, because we got to the end of chapter 12 and suddenly his family were there knocking on the door of the house, and he's talking about who's there. And as we get into chapter 13, you see suddenly that same day, so the same day that his family are trying to get to him, and he's explaining to those around, including the women. He adds that, if you remember last time, the word disciples there is incorporating the women who are now there. Um, it's the same day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea. So at this point, we know he's back in Galilee. You see, if you kind of put all those bits together, and just to kind of to finish that flow off, all the way up has been this controversy following Jesus. The crowds and his popularism is getting bigger, but his position, the understanding, if you like, of the cultural the institutions of Jewish culture are now beginning to turn against Jesus, which probably gives some context to the concern that is expressed by Jesus's family, not in Matthew's gospel, but we hear it in Luke because they're concerned for him, you see. So all of that is a kind of interesting, consistent picture. Now, so Jesus comes out of the house and he sits down by the sea. And I was just explaining, if you were here early on, that I have a fan over here. Because I'm wanting not to get any noise on the recording, I've turned it off. So I'm extremely hot. I would love to be sitting by the sea right now. So he sits down by the sea, and such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and he sat down. And while all of the crowd stood on the beach, in fact, just a quick, hang on a second, what I just want to do is bring that up here. So I'm just going to, if it's okay, I'm just going to mute the sound coming through. Okay, sorry, I've muted everyone else. So when we get to the end for questions, you can turn your microphones back on, but just to kind of cut off little bits of noise I can hear. So the large crowds gather around him. He gets into a boat, sits down, and the crowds are standing on the beach. And of course, you know, in that classic kind of sense, when you're in that position, the natural banks of the Sea of Galilee create little amphitheaters, which of course helps for audio, so a lot of people can listen. And he spoke to them mostly in parables. Almost all translations will say he spoke to them in many parables. The linguistic thing is just a choice. Most people have gone many, because it's certainly in Matthew's gospel, I think is it 7 or 8 parables in a row that we get now. And so they think here we go, here's the many parables. I've gone mostly in parables, because I think this, as it sets up, I think that's the nature probably of how Jesus speaks. He's speaking, there's probably some things that are plain, but a lot of them are these engaging stories, the parables he tells, which, as we're going to see, require a little bit more. They sift the wheat from the chaff, if I can put it that way, if that's not too rude a way of putting it. And so he explains. So he spoke to them mostly in parables, and he's explaining now. The Greek is just simply he said, but actually, if you look at the kind of the context of how he's saying it, it's given as an explanation. So look, a sower goes out to sow, and this is, of course, probably the most famous parable, perhaps after the parable of the Good Samaritan. So we all think we know it really well. Oops, where are we? Let's come back over here. So, and I'm just going to, where are we? Okay, right, it's good. Sorry, I'm just looking at your faces so I can see. So the sower goes out. So, and as he sowed, some, of course, so some of the seed fell. Of course, is often you see it in there as indeed, some indeed, but it's kind of giving a sort of a really, you understand this. So I put some, of course. So as he's sowing, some, of course, fell on the pathways. It's a very generic word for road, paths, ways, all sorts of different kind of routes through. But I think that the implication is, if you've got a field you're going to sow, people crisscross over it, and so some parts through that field have got kind of, that we've trodden down the paths. So I wanted to kind of get that across. So it's almost impossible not to. It's not like somehow the sower is an idiot and goes up to the main road, and throws seed on the main road. It's just that actually in the field that we're going to plant on, people have been crisscrossing through here over the years. While you may not want to throw too much on there, inevitably some of it goes there, and the birds come and they ate them up. And some fell on stony ground where they didn't have much soil, so they sprang up quickly because the soil lacked depth. But when the sun was full risen, they were scorched and withered because they had no root. I think the full risen there has an implication of as you kind of go through summer and actually the sun gets more and more overhead. So it's not kind of almost like here in the morning, seed goes out, pops up in the middle of the day, midday it diminishes. I suspect that in the context as Jesus was saying it, that you get that nuance that as the sun's getting higher in the sky, it's getting hotter and hotter. So it withers because it has no root. Oops, hang on, let's come back. And about others fell on thorns. I'm kind of finishing the story and then we'll come back and unpack the bits. So others fell on thorns and the thorns grew up and they choked them. But others fell on good soil and yielded much fruit, some as much as 100-fold. And there is a little bit I was just talking with you about, Barbara, at the beginning, the bit that's often hidden. Because there's a word there that it's kind of more of about an emphasis towards. So I think in one sense the 100-fold is kind of like up to, it's some of that fruit that falls on good soil is producing as much as 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Those are the kind of more normal. But actually, if you get really good with what it lands on, it could be up to 100-fold. And then Jesus throws out this final little statement, which he's then going to unpack. I've just realized at the top it says Matthew 13, 7 to dash. I obviously forgot to put the verse in that it completes on, but it's obviously to 9 because you can see that. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And this becomes a kind of a key idea that Jesus is going to unpack as he tries to explain to the disciples how parables sort of work. And so this is unusually, of all of Jesus's parables, we get a kind of a full explanation. We get partial explanations on some of the others. Who is my neighbor? Okay, well, explain. But actually, the who is my neighbor is what prompts the parable of the Good Samaritan. So actually, this is kind of unusual. And as I say, I think the reason is because the Matthew and the gospel writers have explained this to help us kind of get our head around something that Jesus gave them as kind of, if you like, an extra piece of revelation that helps you to interpret ordinary revelation, if revelation is ever ordinary. but in other words, by unpacking the way in which the parable is, this particular parable, Jesus explicitly says to them, to you, I'm giving you even more. I'm giving you something extra. And then they have passed it on to us. And actually it becomes a principle which we are supposed to bring to our engagement with all of God's revelation through all of Scripture and so on, which is, as I hinted at from the beginning, is often we have to see deeper. Behold, I speak in parables and ancient mysteries or ancient puzzles, parables and puzzles. So the disciples came around him and asked, and you kind of get the feel, again, it's more of a feel thing. Sometimes the translations sounds like they came to him way after, but actually it just means they came. The word we could just say, you could just translate it as come. You could say they came near. So I've gone with came around him. So why do you speak to them in parables? So perhaps in the context of this sermon, which is perhaps why Matthew has located, if you like, this run of parables, which in Matthew's style won't all have necessarily been told from the boat on this particular day, but the boat and the day is probably the context of this first parable and the explanation as to how parables work. And then Matthew, in his standard way, he's then grouped a kind of a sermon of multiple parables. But he's explained up front as we come to them how you're supposed to try and engage with them. And those principles, as we're going to see, relate right the way across how we deal with both, if you like, inspired preaching, the inspired scripture, anything where we think God is somehow speaking. How do we deal with it? And he replied, because it's been granted to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heavens, but to them it's not been granted. So why is it you speak to them in parables? Well, I'm not only am I speaking to them, but I'm also speaking to you. So this because there's something extra being granted to you. And then he uses this little phrase, for whoever has, it will be given. and he will have an abundance. We often insert the word more there, but in other words, if you've got something, it means you get given something, and then you have an abundance. And he's saying, and we're going to explore that, because it can seem in our world where we love to campaign for social justice, how unfair is that? That just because someone doesn't have something, they get even less in the future. But there is a very real life principle. It's not a political principle, it's actually the way life works, which is why I put the little word at the beginning of the Pareto, Pareto of parables. It just happens in nature. It happens in politics. It happens in economics. It happens in sport. It happens anywhere where success will breed success. And actually, while we may not like it, that's a principle of life. That the bigger I get, because I've eaten more, the more I'm able to eat in the future. You see, it's just one of those. There are a whole host of different reasons that come together on this. I mean, it's a generically true statement. It's not necessarily a moral statement. It's just a focus on there's something going on here. But Jesus uses it to try and train his disciples to think with wisdom about the perhaps the spread of teaching, the spread of the gospel, and so on. So we'll think about that. So for whoever has, it will be given, and he'll have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will get taken away. Not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean by God. It's kind of, I debated whether just to say he'll lose what he has, but it has a more active sense. The word had a more active sense, so I stuck with taken away. But it's not that God necessarily has to come and take it away. It's just somehow you're going to lose it. You're not going to hang on to it. So stop and think for a second. What Jesus is saying? I'm talking to the crowds because they want to hear, but I'm being careful to not engage them too directly with real hard facts and truth. I'm engaging them with more of a narrative that has a certain amount of mystery. That means I have to some degree work my way into it. But because it's been granted to you to know the mysteries, because I've selected you and asked you to be with me, I want to explain something of this to you so you can understand it better and use it with wisdom in your own mission and your own outreach and your own discipleship and training of others. And to kind of cut to the chase in one sense, I think that the outcome that Jesus is talking about here, or the insight is, is summed up perhaps in the phrase where he says, "Don't cast your pearls before swine," which can sound really kind of rude to the person you're thinking of as them as swine. But swine, the pigs will eat pearls as if they're kind of kernels of corn, just crunch them down. There is something about being wise with the way, how much you reveal and when, and actually how much you give as a statement and how much you kind of give as an invitation for someone to respond and give their own thoughts on. And it is a real, I have genuinely is one of my kind of mental priorities at the moment. There's a real conviction for us to retrain as a church to understand this principle a lot better, which is to meet people in where they're at. And actually to talk to them in a way that invites them to tell us where they're at. And because actually it's often in that process that things get worked in a little bit deeper. So as a result of this, I speak to them in parables. So as a result of what? Well, what he's just said. Whoever has, it will be given to, and he will have an abundance. But whoever doesn't have, even what he has will take away. So when I'm talking to the mass crowd, I can't tell what state people, well, I don't necessarily know. And well, maybe I do know, but there will be people at all sorts of different levels in their understanding. And because they're at all sorts of different levels, for some, it will be great. And although it may feel to them like it's not clear when they first get it, but because there's something they already have, which is beginning in this process, it's already beginning to grow. That will kind of, in that context, this will produce more and more. But I need to be cautious because equally, there are those who don't have. And actually, I can start to inoculate them to truth or make them anti-truth or make them cynical about truth. Because if they get it and they hear it at the wrong time, when it doesn't come into something that's already in process in them, as we're going to see, it will produce a negative experience for them, and actually becomes a future problem. And so I'm not going to necessarily anticipate exactly what's there, but I'm going to speak in a way whereby it's an engagement to go deeper, so that perhaps wherever the folks are at, I perhaps will move them forwards, even if we don't fully get them there. And maybe if we come back in 3 weeks' time and we speak again, if that little bit has produced something and they've got to a kind of critical point, then actually you could preach the same message, and this time it will take them even further. If you get the feel with the way those things work. And because there is a danger that if you don't have, and here it comes, and you get the seed, even what you do have, even what you had at that point, you get, well, I got enthusiastic about it and it didn't go anywhere. And so now why bother listening? Why bother turning up? Because I got nothing out of that last time. So as a result of this, I speak to them in parables, because seeing they don't see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And so he says, so in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, saying, in hearing you'll hear, but not understand at all. And in seeing you'll see, but not perceive anything. So they're hearing, and hopefully the stories are enjoyable at a certain level. But they don't necessarily fully understand. But in a weird way, that's kind of good if you're at a low level anyway. It's better transformationally that you engage with the ideas. And this is just generally true of education. If you just kind of teach facts as statements and return in parrot fashion, there is a certain foundational layer where that's required. but actually people really understand when you give them a part and they start to play with it and try and explore it and then try and fill in the gaps. And then even if they can't fully fill in the gaps, when you give them the things that fill in the gaps, they receive it in a way that goes, that's great. Whereas if you give it to someone when they're in the place where they haven't got the whole story, but they haven't really struggled with it and aren't really interested, it just feels patronizing. And I can't really see the power or force of what you've just given me. So in the whole thing now just becomes another phrase that I just do ignore every time I hear it. So I'm kind of talking in the extremes, but we do see those phenomena that kind of go on in the kind of educational circles. And I think this is particularly true when we think about how the gospel goes out. It was kind of the thinking evangelist, what's his name? Francis Schaeffer, who I reread The God Who Was There recently, so he's kind of fresh in my head. I can't remember if it's in the original version of the book I had or whether it was on the audio book. Kind of, there's a couple of like appendices, later ones that added. But he talks about the importance of understanding the role of pre-evangelism, which really, in one sense, is evangelism. But it's evangelism for those whose level is so low that to really understand, it would be casting pearls before swine. So you have to kind of engage. And his approach there is all about the questions. He says very explicitly, he tends to ask them questions that make them explain their positions more, and they start to see the weaknesses before he tries to give them the gospel. And so, I remember hearing the debates, I was growing up with with people who are enthusiastic in their evangelism. We don't want pre-evangelism. What's that? Well, it's probably an unhelpful word because it's all part of the process. and I think it's a process that Jesus is aware of. Part of the problem is we hear the context for those who are in the discipleship program. So they have already got the amount that's going to mean they're going to get more. Because the kind of, certainly Matthew's gospel is probably written as a discipleship aid. So the way we hear the stories are into that kind of context. Whereas, but actually, if we understand this text, what Jesus is saying, I'm conscious of it when I'm speaking to them. Because actually, I want that whatever they do take hold of, I don't want it to become a disappointment. Because he then kind of unpacks the parable, of course, and he says, blessed your eyes because they see and they hear, and your ears because they hear. Truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. So then he's going to say, so here then, I put it in quotes because he's just been talking about it. So now, hear with understanding the parable of the sower. This is what you're being privileged with, because I'm entrusting you with actually my mission, which you're watching me and I'm making statements which don't seem like they're all about, kind of, you need to repent and believe and receive me right now. They seem to be about weird things like people going fishing and people looking for coins and so on. Why are you engaged in that kind of storytelling? Well, I want you to understand, because actually there's some preparation. We need to meet folks where they're at. And the wonderful thing with a parable is you can hear it multiple ways. I always, that was quite a little revelationary moment for me when I remember first reading Joachim Jeremiah's book on the parables. So I think I can't remember what his church background is, but he certainly wasn't kind of a charismatic Catholic. I think he may have been Catholic or maybe Church of England. But he talks about the way in which actually the parables meant different things to different listeners. And he explores those different things. And once you see that, you think, wow, that's brilliant. The story is told in a way that different people are at different places see it with different emotional context. And there's always therefore an emotional context, which often we've totally missed because we don't read them with any emotion nowadays. And I always thought, when I was thinking about what he's saying there, I was thinking about the parable of the talents. Because I remember every now and again, like a teacher in school would try and do a little talk, on assembly. If they used the parable of the talents, there was almost always an emotional response. And I don't say this meanly. I think it's kind of very natural, which is, well, that doesn't seem very fair. Why does the rich so-and-so who's got all the money in the first place get even more money at the end of it? But actually there is an emotional response, which is religious people who've heard the story 1,000 times read to them, we've lost it. But that's a totally legitimate response, and makes you then ask questions about, because Jesus does, what is it if I do what it's my money? It challenges me to think about why I got offended, if that makes sense. So you see the genius of the kind of the storytelling. And then here Jesus is saying, so look, prophets and righteous people, they longed to be in this moment. So much of the characters we meet in the Old Testament were longing for this moment, which you're getting to. And at the heart of how God communicates in parables and hidden sayings is there's something going on in front of you right now in the person of Jesus. And it's only with kind of, if you like, engagement, and as you start to see, suddenly you start to kind of get a sense of God's revelation. Yeah, I was going to go off on a bit of a tangent there, but we'll keep an eye on the time. Yeah, we're not doing badly for so many verses. Actually, we've got a lot of verses when we're getting through them at a reasonable speed. But they did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but they didn't get to hear it. So now hear with understanding the parable of the sower. Because everyone hearing the word of the kingdom, see, he doesn't just say, the word of salvation. It's actually how God speaks. So it's even how God is speaking to me as a Christian who kind of, signed up at Billy Graham when I was a 15-year-old. Actually, it wasn't Billy Graham, but, the thing I mean. It wasn't just then. It wasn't how I received the gospel, because often we reduce this to how did you get saved, And it's not that it doesn't apply to that, because obviously it does, because actually often in that context, the word does go out and people respond in these different ways. But actually that's just narrowing it. It's actually just generally, this is how when God speaks, this is how it will bear fruit in you. But not and as I apply it to myself, I recognize that over the years there have been things I'm really enthusiastic when I hear them, but like the one with shallow roots, they don't go deep in me. And then you kind of do all of that, and then years later, not doesn't even have to be years later, but later then you've got cynical. Yeah, I know about that, and that attitude you encounter so regularly. I don't mean it critically. When you come up and someone says, I think we've got a great idea, we could do this in church. Oh yeah, we did that 10 years ago. Didn't really work. See, because what's happened is it's gone into the shallow level. We've got enthusiastic about it. I haven't read the verse, and what was sown on stony ground, he who hears the word quickly accepts it with joy. But he's got no internal roots. So he endures for a while, but tribulation comes or persecution on account of the word. In time he falls away. And actually, that's a bad thing, because now we're inoculated. Now we've become cynical. It's much, much harder, even though it was really genuinely true. So there are those who come in, and because of the context, what they've heard is going to get stolen away. But now they've done the tick. I went to the Billy Graham mission, because you asked me. But I was worried about this. I was thinking about that. There was this on TV that I was missing, and all those things. I wasn't really paying attention. Whatever happened, it went. But now, next time you ask me, I went last time. It didn't really account for me. Or I hear the message on a Sunday morning to do something. I want to get really enthusiastic about it. We can really help, get really into it, and then we actually hit. It's a bit inconvenient and it's harder work than I thought it was, and I don't get as much satisfaction for doing the works of service or whatever, and I lose my enthusiasm for it. And now I get cynical about anybody else who keeps doing it. You see, so it kind of is happening in those ways. And then of course we get the last two. What's sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the wily distractions of the age and deceptions of wealth choke the word. Older, more kind of sedate translations just go through the cares of the world, but it's got that kind of sense of, it draws my attention. You could go with distractions, but I've gone for wily distractions. And the wealth, they choke out the world, and he becomes unfruitful. So actually, again, we understand that generally, but actually Jesus isn't just saying this is something that happens. He's actually saying this is why when I speak, I'm conscious of that, and I try and deliver it in a way that's not going to produce unhelpful fruit at the wrong moment. It will hopefully, because that principle, if I've got something, if there's some inkling in me, it's not that big. If I get something that helps it grow a little bit bigger and then stops, and then it comes in the next time and it grows a little bit more, eventually I'm going to get onto the thing that's going to grow. Whereas if it's in me and it's small and I give too big a thing, I might be enthusiastic about it, but then when it all goes wrong, I'm now kind of resistant to that, as a future way, something that the Lord might reveal to me. However, what was sown on the good ground, this is whom hears the word, understands it, who undoubtedly bear fruit and produces some as much as 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. And that's where I'm going to finish today, because we kind of then move on to new parables after that. But as I said, in wanting to put the whole lot together, Jesus introduces his sermon on parables, or the parable sermon, where he has parable after parable. Some are just one-liners, Kingdom of God's like a mustard seed that's so tiny, but it grows into a little bush that the trees, some of them are longer, but they're all things that can be engaged with at different levels, so that actually the real hard truth that we might distill from them, the thing that really produces fruit in us, if we're not ready for it, we can still engage with it at this level, and we can come back for more tomorrow, rather than now I've done that, but don't want to do it anymore. And so on a personal level, I think it's it gives a foundation, I think, to the idea of the sort of what as I say, sometimes we unhelpfully call pre-evangelism, which is actually that place where sometimes you have to sow ideas because people aren't ready for the ultimate idea, but you can sow questions and thoughts, which you can often do with the telling of the story or asking somebody else to recount to you. So how do you see this then? And often things that we feel emotionally, we see them emotionally. When we try and articulate them, we go, do you know what? It doesn't really work, does it? But now I'm a bit more open for you to saying, well, maybe that emotional base wasn't the right one. And you've got to, it can sound cynical when I put it this way. You've got an opportunity for a gentle kind of leading of the person to what we think is more ultimately going to be good for them. So those are my thoughts. Anyone want to ask questions? I forgot, of course, we've taken the half hour and I haven't left any space for questions. So anyone want to ask anything? You can unmute now. No, now we've done that.
You mentioned a couple of things that you'd read, the Francis Schaeffer book,
yeah,
and also Joachim, somebody I didn't catch
Jeremiah, yeah, the parables of Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
I put it in the chat, Barbara.
Oh, it's lovely. Thank you. I haven't seen the chat.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Joe. So I'll go and look on the chat now. Yeah. Yeah, the parables of Jesus. Yeah. Oh, he's German Lutheran. There we go. Yeah.
Thank you.
German Lutheran.
And the Francis Schaeffer, was that a book that you'd
Yeah,
read?
that was The God Who Is There, which is one he wrote in the late 60s. I think it was late 60s, early 70s. I mean, it's hard going as a read because
Right.
he's dealing with a culture that with cultural icons that we've left behind, and he does also quote a lot of kind of academic studies. But he was a really and so I think you need to reinterpret the writing for the current situation, but
Yeah.
it's very relevant. In other words, you feel like that somebody else needs to come and make a similar cultural argument again.
Yeah. Mm, mm, yeah.
Yeah.
It's really helpful. Thank you,
Yeah.
Kristen. The whole thing. I felt I felt there's a lot of truth in the parable of the sower, as you say. You easily just dismiss it as how you became a Christian, and
Yeah.
I felt like particularly it's how we might respond to prophetic words and really take them seriously. And I suppose when I was a child, probably and read it, I thought, oh dear, um, it all seems a bit random, the soil, instead of realizing that actually we cultivate the soil of
We
our
cultivate. No,
heart.
it's exactly right. I think I think is the unspoken direction that the parable is saying, which is there's various types of soil here.
Mm,
If we do it in a way, whatever they've got, if it's really small, if they're a bit of a hard path at the moment, the thing is some of those seeds on the hard path won't get eaten by the birds, and if they break up the path a little bit, maybe the next time round it will be shallow ground and maybe the next time. But what we don't want to try and do is throw everything in one go
mm,
and just produce that. Well, none of that worked. so yeah, along the lines. But I think as I said, I think it's part of the way God speaks from a revelationary point of view. So it includes kind of rhema words, the breathed by the Spirit for today, as well
mm,
as the kind of eternal written down words
mm.
as well. We somehow, the way we engage with them is we try and let them go deeper in us so that they've got enough root that as time goes on it produces more fruit.
Yeah. Yes, I thought of a bit like, when you buy a packet of seeds and you get this lovely picture on the front,
Yeah.
and you think, yeah, but if you leave it in the seed packet, it will never be that. It's got to have that right soil, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And some loving care to actually be, to come into the fullness of it.
No, and I think just generally because of what we were just saying, it's totally legitimate with the parables to kind of speculate around the outside. That's definitely one of the things I got from Joachim Jeremias, which is that's what they're intended to do. So we're intended to think things like you just said, Barbara. Jesus doesn't explicitly say, but you can cultivate the soil, and we can probably cut across some things. That's part of one of the ways we bring our own thought into the mix. Actually, if that is the case, this is what maybe I ought to do. and so I don't think there are bits of the Bible you can say, well, look, this is more this for this, but there are things, particularly with the parables, the things we might imagine to do are actually part of the way God uses to kind of lead us forward and deeper and so on. So the things we see in the narratives.
It seems really hopeful that, because I often read it as kind of like somebody's like this, or they're like that, or they're like that. The fact that you can progress from one place to another,
Yeah,
and see that as a progression rather
and
than
on a personal level, I think I see it in my own growth and development. There are areas to which I thought I knew everything about that, because they'd kind of bounced in and then they kind of got stolen away, but I've heard them, so I don't need to, and they didn't really excite me, so I don't need to hear them again. And then years later you kind of go, oh, do you know, that's really key to my kind of personal development and growth. But so in me there are areas which are kind of hard and the seed just bounces off there are areas that I've definitely been shallow in and got really enthusiastic, and 2 weeks later it's kind of, oh, this is a bit more. Take fasting, for instance. Hear a good preach on, oh yeah, look, all the breakthrough we're going to get in prayer because we fast. Try it a couple of weeks, and you and missing a couple of meals, and it's kind of, well, that doesn't work. Good. Excellent. Well, thanks ever so much for being here, folks. It's always good to see you guys. I'm going to enjoy saying goodbye and turning my fan back on. To be honest,
Yeah.
Is the weather unbearable where you are in France, Mike? Yeah. Although I guess Joe and Neil, probably being a bit further north, you maybe have a degree or so less, is it? Yeah.
Quite pleasant.
It's very nice here. It's
It's
sunny.
just got that nice bright with a cool breeze, is it? Yeah. My kind of summer. Okay then. All right then.
Thanks so much, Kristen.
Yeah,
good.
thank you
I'll
very
see you
much.
next time then.
See you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.